Much, Brandy. Thank you, Musicians Church. So good to be with you here this morning in the presence of the Lord to worship. I want to express for myself and my family our great appreciation for you and all of your outpouring of love and concern, your cards, your texts, your phone calls, and all. Last weekend when my mom passed away, and I just can't tell you how much it meant to us, all of your expressions of love, and especially that 14 of you would travel 600 miles round trip to attend her memorial service in Euless. That was a real encouragement to all of us, and we thank you so much for being there. It's good to be part of a loving church family, isn't it? Over and over again, I heard, as we talked to people, and I've heard this said many times over the years, I don't know what people do who don't have the Lord in their life. I don't know what people do who don't have a loving church family when they walk through the valleys of life. And I'm just glad that we don't have to know that. Can you see the hand of God in the things that are happening in your life, even in the last week or so? And over this summer, as my mom fought for her life, I could see the hand of God at work. That may sound like a strange thing to say in the midst of a loss, but it's true that we can see God's hand in our lives. I hope you do. And I want to look at a text this morning about a young man that kind of leaves the question open, at least at this point in his life, but it helps us to ask the question. Join me, would you, in Genesis chapter 29. Get your bulletin out, turn it over. Let's take a couple of notes as we go along this morning. Genesis chapter 29, starting at the beginning of that chapter, it says this: Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham and Sarah. He is the son of Isaac and Rebekah. Abraham, of course, the great man of faith. And so he is destined to become that Jacob that we read about when God says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That hasn't happened yet. Right now, at this part of the story, God says, I'm the God of Abraham, and I'm the God of Isaac. Jacob is still working things out in his life. He's on his way to Haran, and that's several hundred miles from where he lives in Canaan, which would ultimately become the Promised Land, which is today Israel. And traveling back then was difficult. It says literally in the Hebrew, I don't know if there are any English translations that render it this way. The NIV says he continued his journey. Literally it says he lifted up his feet. And this is the only place in the Bible where it says this in the Hebrew. He lifted up his feet. And of course, students of Scripture scratch their head and wonder why that phrase is there. And one potential answer is that this is an unusual time in Jacob's life. In the chapter just before this, he has encountered God in a dream in the middle of the night, and God spoke to his heart. And one of the things that God told him was, I will be with you. Wouldn't you love to hear God tell you personally, out loud, I will be with you? Darlene, would you like that? David, Tommy, Marie, would you love it to hear God say, I will be with you? So maybe some commentators think that he's lifted up his feet. Literally, his feet are kind of light. He's walking on air. He's got this new sense of purpose and excitement in his life because he knows that God has promised to be with him. Verse 2, there he saw a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. The narration goes into a lot of detail here about this well and the stone. The well, of course, is water's a great commodity at this point. It is today. We don't realize it because we just go into our kitchen and hit the switch and it turns on. But it wasn't that way back then. They recognized the value of water and they protected it, especially those who had flocks and crops. Verse 4, Jacob asked the shepherd, my brothers, where are you from? We're from Haran, they replied. And he said to them, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Yes, we know him, they answered. And Jacob said, is he well? Yes, he is, they said. And here comes his daughter, Rachel, with his sheep. Now, Laban is Jacob's uncle. He's actually the one that Jacob is traveling to meet. And they didn't have cell phones or Facebook or any of that kind of stuff back then. You just took off. Nobody knew you were coming. You didn't know if you would make it. And when you got there, you didn't know if you were going to find the people that you were looking for. And so this is a pretty big deal that he rolls into town and he finds his uncle right away, Laban. It's no coincidence, although some people might think that it is. Verse 7, look, he said, Jacob, the sun's still high. It's not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture. Now, if you stop and think about this, back up just a little bit, what he had just seen is Rachel. And we're going to find out in a few moments that Rachel is a beauty. And when you read this kind of slow and think about it, you realize that what's happening here is Jacob was talking to these shepherds, and suddenly he saw Rachel. Oh, that's Laban's daughter. She's pretty. And she's walking up, and he's thinking, I'd like a few minutes alone with her. And so he comes back to these shepherds, and he's like, what are you guys doing hanging around here? You need to take your flocks and get back out into the fields. Because he wants a little time alone with this beautiful woman that's walking up. Things are clicking for Jacob. He found Laban. That's Laban's daughter, and she is a beauty. Oh, and by the way, did I mention? Jacob is actually looking for a wife, too. Okay? So everything is really coming together for Jacob at this point. Except these guys won't cooperate. Verse 8, we can't, they replied. Until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well, then we'll water the sheep. Okay. So while, verse 9, he was still talking to them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was the shepherdess. And when Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep, he went over and he rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. You got to get this in your mind, okay? Here's a guy who looks like he's falling in love at first sight. And he wants some time alone with this girl. And these pesky shepherds won't leave him alone. They say the rock is too big to roll away by themselves. But he is going to show off for his new girl. Okay? So he comes over and throws off his outer garment. And he's moving that rock out of the way. Did you see that, girl? And, okay, guys, now you can water your sheep and get out of here. So he is excited by, in fact, look at verse 11. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Oh, I can't believe it. Can't believe that I found a cousin. She's his cousin. And he's kissing her. I don't know what she's thinking about all of this. But he is pretty excited. Now, verse 10, as is often the truth in our English translations, a little smoothed out. Here, follow along in verse 10. Let me give it to you in a little bit more of a literal sense. Here's what the Hebrew text says. And so it was when Jacob saw the daughter of Laban, brother of his mother, and the flock of Laban, brother of his mother. Jacob approached and rolled away the stone from the mouth of the well, and he watered the flock of Laban, brother of his mother. That's too many brothers of his mothers for English. And we think it's a little repetitious and rough, and so our English translations smooth it out. But the narrator, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, has emphasized that 3 times right there together because he wants us to see that, that Jacob has found the family that he was looking for. This is no coincidence. He wants us to see the hand of God at work in what's happening here in Jacob's life. So Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud, verse 12, and he told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. And so she ran and told her father, Laban. And as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried, literally ran. They changed that word so that it's not repetitious. But the Hebrew writer he wanted the repetition. He wanted to see everybody run. And she runs, he runs. They're excited. He runs to meet him. He embraced him. He kissed him. A lot of kissing going on here. He brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all these things. You know, the narrator every now and then just catches your attention. You're thinking, what things? Because we never find out. Did Jacob tell him that he was on the run, really, from his brother who wanted to kill him? You see, he was looking for a wife, that's true, but one of the reasons he was looking for a wife is because he deceived his brother and his father, and his brother was so angry with him that he wanted to kill him, and so his mother decided, you know what, it's time for you to go look for a wife. And you need to do it several hundred miles away from home. So they got him out of town. Did he tell all that to Laban? I don't know. He was a young man. He might have done that. But Laban, in verse 14, he says to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." The guiding hand of God. Now, the text never has the word God or Lord or any of that in these verses. The narrator has put this together under the guiding hand of God in such a way that we're supposed to see on our own, through the details of what's happening in Jacob's life, how everything is clicking, everything's coming together. We're supposed to see that God really is with him. Because remember, right before this, God told him, "I will be with you." And you would think, if God's in your life, things are going to go well, right? And so far, they are going well for Jacob. We wonder at this point if he noticed it. Unbelievers would say, it was just a fortunate coincidence. It's just, there's no God, it just happened. But the narrator wants us to see it differently. But here's a question. On your outline, here's the first thing I'd like you to write down this morning. Did Jacob see God's hand in his encounter with Rachel? Did Jacob see God's hand in his encounter with Rachel? It's pretty obvious he fell in love with her right away. You remember that day when you fell in love? First time you saw her? First time you saw him? Today is the anniversary for Karen and me. 29 years today we've been married. Don't worry, I know that all those applause are for her. And I can still remember the first day that I met her. It was in junior college. We were both music students. I'd never seen her before. She had just enrolled, and I can still remember like it was yesterday, the minute that I laid eyes on her, I said, "I got to get to know that cute blonde over there." And I found out a way to give her guitar lessons, okay? Now, you see what guitar lessons can lead to, all right? And I don't think I knew it at the time, but I would testify today that I could see God's hand at work in bringing me together with Karen. She's been a great blessing to me, a huge, huge blessing. I wonder if Jacob could see at this point that God was blessing him. Did Jacob see God's hand in his encounter with Rachel? Did you see this week this Dr. Kent Brantley? He works for Samaritan's Purse, and he's one of the ones who was in Liberia helping people who have this Ebola virus in West Africa. And he and another woman contracted the virus, and it's deadly. About 90%, if I remember right, about 90% of people who get it die. And they brought him back to the States, and miraculously, he has recovered. They gave him an experimental drug. The doctors say they don't know if the experimental drug helped, hurt, or did nothing, but he survived. And when he left the hospital, there was a press conference. They did the press conference because they didn't want people to be concerned about the Ebola virus being set free in the population of the United States. They wanted the doctors to be able to say, "Hey, it's okay. He doesn't have the virus anymore, neither does she, the woman that was with him, so don't be concerned about it." But at the press conference, Kent Brantley, just like Paul the Apostle, took the occasion to get to the mic and give God all kinds of glory. Anybody, have you seen that? It was a wonderful testimony. He was talking about how it was a miracle that he was saved, and he wasn't dissing the doctors either, okay? He hugged their necks, and he gave them thanks for all that they did. He recognized that they worked really hard to take care of him, but at the end of the day, he gave God all the glory. He said, "God saved my life. God saved my life." And I was a little bit surprised, not too much, this week to see in reading people's reactions on the internet and different media that some people were very upset by Kent Brantley's response. What's he doing talking about God? He doesn't need to be talking about God. He needs to be thanking the doctors and all this sort of thing. They're just uncomfortable with the idea that Dr. Brantley would give God the glory. But here's a man, 33 years old, who's already given his life to ministry through Samaritan's Purse, using his gift as a doctor to minister to those who can't pay him back in any way whatsoever. Very Christ-like. He sees the hand of God at work in his life, even though he almost died. Even though he almost died, he said, "I can see the hand of God in my life." And I'm sure he's glad that God's restored him. That's what he said. So here's the question that comes to my mind that I'd like you to jot down. And honestly ask yourself on your outline, it's the next thing. Do we see God's hand when things go well? when things go well. As a pastor, I've noticed that some people forget God when things go well. Some people seek God out when they're struggling. They need God's help, but just as soon as everything's going well, they forget about God. I guess they figure they don't need Him anymore. Everything's going to be... They don't recognize the fact that God is the one who's making things go well in their life in the first place, and they're not giving Him glory for the things that He's doing. We don't know yet whether Jacob recognized what God was doing, but let's move on here. Verse 14, Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh." After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said, "Just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Uh-oh. This is taking a little bit of an ominous turn here. It sounds innocent enough at first. Verse 16, now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. He's already met Rachel. By now he's met Leah too. Verse 17, Leah had, in the NIV, weak eyes. If you're reading another translation this morning, it may sound exactly the opposite. The King James says tender. The New King James says delicate. The New American says lovely. Lovely. Now the reason for that is because the word means sort of delicate and soft. You can take that 2 ways. You know, delicate and soft can be weak, it can be bad, or it can be pretty, it can be good. So our translators sort of have to make up their mind which way they're going to go with this. And that's why you're getting 2 different things. One thing's clear though, look at the last verse. It says that Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. So however we take the thing about Leah's eyes, it's clear that there's a contrast here between the 2 sisters. The older sister, whether her eyes were pretty or not, she did not turn heads the way her little sister did. Rachel was a beauty. Okay? So we had the 2 sisters. Verse 18, Jacob was in love with Rachel. Well, we kind of already knew that. We saw him show off back at the rock. So we figured he was in love with her. Now we know that he is. "I'll work for you," look what he says, 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Now, he doesn't have any money, and back then you had to give money for, your family would give money when you married a girl, and then the father would give her money too. That's just part of it. And he's just a young single guy out on his own. He doesn't have anything. All he has to offer is his own labor. Now, guys, think about this. He's in a tough spot here. He's got to be careful. You know, stop and think. If he said, "Hey, I'll work for you for a couple of weeks for your daughter," that wasn't going to go over too well, okay? Rachel wouldn't be too impressed with that. I mean, let's face it, ladies, what if your husband thought that you were worth a couple of weeks worth of work? So he's in a tough spot here. He's got to say the right thing. He wants to impress his future father-in-law and Rachel, and so he goes over the top. He says, "I'll work for 7 years. It's pretty generous. Verse 19, Laban said, "Well, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." Now, some of you may be asking, well, wait a minute, he's going to marry his cousin? Yes. This is a cross-cousin marriage, which even today is not unusual in certain cultures, and it certainly wasn't back then in the ancient Near East. As long as the cousins were, as long as the siblings were of different sex, it's an uncle and an aunt, not 2 uncles, not 2 aunts, then they would have these cross-cousin marriages and kind of keep it all in the family, so to speak. You might be wondering too, well, what about Rachel? Has she ever consulted on this? Not in this text, but we saw earlier that when Rebekah was given away in marriage that they asked her if she was willing to go with Isaac. So that gives us an indication that it may not sound like the lady has a whole lot of say in all of this, but there are indications that she had veto power, okay? And Rachel doesn't enter into this and exercise any veto power. So it says in verse 20, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Somebody has said this, happiness is when you have someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. Think about that. That's pretty good. I like that. Someone to love, something to do, and something to look forward to. And Jacob had all of that. He loved Rachel. He had a job to do, and he was looking forward to the day that he got to marry her. I'm sure that these were 7 years that he would remember fondly for the rest of his life. I hope you have some years like that in your life. Maybe you're there right now. Verse 21, then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. Sounds a little impatient there, doesn't it? He's waited for 7 years. Give me my wife. My time is completed and I want to lie with her. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. Now there's no reply from Laban here. Notice no words out of his mouth. He just busies himself, goes to work, putting the feast together. Time for the feast. He seems to be obfuscating here just a little bit. I had to use that word this morning. You like that? Obfuscating. Kind of confusing things just a little bit. We may not see it the first time through, but after we go to the end, we go back and we go, I see. Now, in ancient Near Eastern wedding was a big deal. That there was a procession to the bride's house and the procession back to the groom's house, and then there was a big feast, and everybody was invited. Lots to eat. And when the time came, the groom would take his cloak and he would wrap it around his bride. She was completely covered. She was covered all the way through this. All you could see were her eyes. That might be one reason they mentioned Leah's eyes, by the way. And he put his cloak around her, and they went off to the nuptial chamber where they would consummate the marriage, and everyone continued to party, and they partied for an entire week. And during that week, the groom and the bride, they were treated like a queen and a king. So that's what's happening here. Verse 23, but when evening came, Laban, took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob. And Jacob lay with her, slept with her. And Laban gave his servant girl Zilpah to his daughter as her maidservant. That was part of the custom back then. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Things are going to get ugly now. Yet people might wonder, how in the world did Laban pull this off? But you have to remember that the bride was completely covered, that it was completely dark by the time he slept with her, and there's a pretty good chance that Jacob was completely what? Yeah, sloshed. All right, so it really wasn't as hard to do this as you might think it was. But he did pull it off. And Laban replied in verse 26, oh, it's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. You think you could have told me that in the last 7 years that I was working for you? Laban knew what he was doing. Verse 27, finish this daughter's bridal week, then we'll give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years' work. End of good feelings. Things were going so well. But Jacob has been deceived. And there's really nothing he can do about it. He's already consummated the marriage with Leah. He has to finish that week with her. And he wants Rachel so bad, he's waited for 7 years to have her. She's the one that he's really in love with, that he's going to work the other 7 years for her. Remember, he's hundreds of miles away from anyone that he knows. His friends, his family, he's there on his own. He is vulnerable. There's nothing he can do. He is in Laban's hands. Verse 28, and Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. So he paid cash for Leah, and he went in on the installment plan for Rachel. I guess Laban knew that he couldn't hold Rachel away from him for another 7 years. He had to give him something. And whether or not they had another wedding for Rachel, it doesn't say. But Laban really made out like a bandit here. He made sure that both of his daughters got married. And that may seem strange. One man married to 2 women, and 2 women who are sisters. And those are good questions that need to be asked, but let's save those till next week. We'll talk a little bit about that, because those are good questions. But Laban made out like a bandit, and we have to ask ourselves, why was Jacob so sheepish here? Why was he so silent? Why was he so willing to just go along with this and not fight back? He was mad at first, but as soon as Laban said, it's not our custom to give the younger away before the older, suddenly he was silent. And it's hard not to believe that when he heard those 2 words, younger and older, just like that, he realized, uh-oh. Because you see, what Jacob had done at home is he had taken advantage of his older brother. And he had taken his older brother's place. He had deceived his father and his older brother. And he had flipped the two around, and now the exact same thing was happening to him. What goes around, what? That's what I've always been told. In the Bible, it says it like this. What you sow, you reap. And even though God's name is never mentioned in all of this, without a doubt, the narrator is wanting us to see that Jacob, the deceiver, has become Jacob the what? The deceived. Somebody has turned the tables on him. Verse 29, Laban gave his servant girl Bilhah to his daughter Rachel, and her maidservant. Jacob lay with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. We're in trouble. Already we can see that things are not going to go well. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. Then look at verse 31. When the Lord saw, finally the Lord, 30 verses, no God, no Lord, no Bible, no nothing. No prayer, no worship, nothing but people living their lives apparently ignoring God. And then in verse 31, when the Lord saw. You see, the Lord had been looking at all that was going on all this time. And I've already said, and I believe that God was at work in Jacob's life when Jacob had this encounter with Rachel, but now things have gone south. Is God still at work in Jacob's life? Could God still be at work in Jacob's life even though things are now not going so well? Is God at work in our lives when things go good, but not at work in our lives when things go bad? On your outline, write this down. Did Jacob see God's hand in his loss to Laban? Did Jacob see God's hand in his loss to Laban? There are some people, some Bible teachers who will tell you that when things are going good, that means God is blessing you. When things are going poorly, that means that God has removed his blessing from you. There may be some truth to that, but is it that simple? Is God still at work in our lives when things go against us? Most people believe that the narrator here is trying to tell us that Jacob was tasting a little bit of his own medicine. I think everybody would agree that God disciplines us. That Jacob was maybe being disciplined a little bit here and asked to grow up some. But did he see? Did he see? Many, many chapters later in the book of Genesis, when Jacob is an old man and it comes time for him to bless his sons, he has 12 of them, he says this. Then he blessed Joseph and he said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life, to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys." I don't know if Jacob noticed it here in the text we're looking at this morning, but sometime later in his life, as he reflected back on the things that had happened in his life, Jacob finally realized that in the good times and in the bad times, God's hand had been at work in his life. Sometimes it takes a little bit of space. We need to be able to look back on things with some perspective and say, you know, at the time, I was mad at God, but now I can see that God's hand was at work in my life. Jacob finally reached that point. Here's the last thing on your outline this morning. Do we see God's hand when things go against us? Do you see God's hand when things go against you? Can you accept the fact that maybe God is disciplining you? Can I accept the fact that maybe God is disciplining me when things go against me? And there's something that I need to learn. Instead of just getting mad at God and giving up on him and saying, God must have left me because things aren't going good anymore. Or it may even be that God expects me or you to grow through some obstacle. We haven't done anything wrong. He isn't disciplining us. We're just expected to grow and to hang on to him and to see his hand even when things are going poorly. You know, I have to admit to you that I can see that God blessed me 3 times with my mom's passing. That may sound like a strange thing to say. It may even sound like a selfish thing to say. Because for my mom to pass away at 73 years of age, that just seems so young. None of us were ready for her to go. We always thought that she would outlive all of us. She was so healthy. She was a very spiritual woman. I guess even I get caught in that trap of thinking that when we're really spiritual, then everything's going to go good in our lives. You know, we'll live a long time, we'll be healthy, everything will go good. Listen, let me tell you something. I'm not the only one who thinks this. I know she's my mom, and I know you think I'm biased, and I am. But look at her. She was quite a woman. If anybody deserved, if you can even use those words around God, if anybody deserved to live more than 73 years and to enjoy her great-grandchildren, it was Barbara Foster. She's not the only one, but she was one of them. Nevertheless, I can see that God blessed me, and others too, but me 3 times. The first time was on a Friday morning. I suddenly felt the urge to get in my car, leave everything behind, and go to my mother. And that doesn't happen very often, almost never. That's a poor reflection on me, not on her. And when I got within an hour or two of where she was, I suddenly realized that she was going to have, they were just deciding that she was about to have major surgery. And if I hadn't left when I did, I wouldn't be there for that major surgery. And I got to stand by her bedside, hold the hands of my father, my brother, my 2 sisters, and pray for her. And she said things to me that just broke my heart at that point. I wouldn't trade that for the world. And that was a God thing. God made sure that I was there for that. Here's the second time that God blessed me. Last Friday, I also had to get up and leave everything because things weren't going well, and it was time to bring Mom home to die. But, you know, Mom could have been at home for weeks until she died. I had no idea that she was so close to death. None of us did. She came home Friday night, and she died Saturday morning. If I hadn't left everything and gone to her, then I wouldn't have been there when she died. I could have said, well, I can work this weekend and go next week, because she'll probably live at least for a few days, weeks, months. But for some reason, I felt like I needed to go. And I give God glory for that. That wasn't me. That was God saying, no, you need to go now. You need to go now. And here's the third thing. Saturday morning, when I woke up, you know, it's not very often that I get to be away. And if it's a Saturday morning, I'm away. Here's the thing that I like to do. You tell me if you like to do this. I like to lay in the bed. Okay? I'm just telling you. And I looked at the clock, and it was about 7:30, and it's already late, and I'm thinking, you know, there's nothing to do today. I deserve it. I'm just going to lay in the bed. But I couldn't. The night before, I'd found my mom's Bible, and I'd opened it up and started reading it. That was a special time. My mom's Bible was a well-worn Bible. It was a great Bible. And I loved flipping through it and looking at her notes and reading. And I got up, I said, I need to go downstairs. So I took my mom's Bible, I went downstairs and sat by her bed, and I began to read to her from the Bible. Read about heaven, read the 23rd Psalm, talked to her about some of the notes she put in the Bible, about the Lord's Prayer, prayed with her, talked to her, told her I loved her. And I didn't know this was going to happen. But then she died. And I can see the hand of God making sure that I had those moments with her. And some people would say, Richard, how can you see the hand of God when you lost your mother? And I'll say, I don't know, but I can. I can. In the good times and in the bad times. Can you see the hand of God in your life? Would you bow with me?